The funeral of my 30-year career at Stratagrowth started on a damp Tuesday morning in my kitchen, not with a ceremonial watch or a tearful speech, but with a cold, clinical email. I sat at my wooden kitchen table, a half-empty mug of chamomile tea growing cold beside my untouched sourdough toast. Outside my window, a persistent Ohio drizzle fell from a leaden sky, casting a gloomy gray light across the linoleum floor. The refrigerator hummed its usual low, vibrating note, a comforting sound that suddenly felt incredibly lonely. The email had arrived from the Human Resources Department, although there was absolutely nothing human about its contents or its delivery. It was an automated notification that looked as though it had been spat out by a chatbot choking on corporate jargon. The message was brief, brutal, and entirely devoid of basic courtesy. No greeting, no signature, and not even a single comma splice to suggest that a living, breathing person had typed it. It simply informed me that, due to evolving fiscal priorities and cost optimization reviews, my pension benefits were temporarily suspended. 3 decades of early mornings, skipped lunches, and working through weekends, all summarized in a single, icy sentence. I was the one who had stayed awake in the server room when the cooling units failed on a hot July night, saving millions of dollars in customer data. I was the one who had plugged a $6 million cash shortfall overnight when our first operating chief tried to expense a luxury yacht in the south of France. I had always been content to be the quiet scaffolding of the company, holding up the walls while younger, flashier executives took the stage and the credit. Now, the new private equity firm that had acquired us 2 years ago decided that my decades of loyalty were nothing more than an inconvenient expense on their balance sheet. They wanted to optimize their margins, and they figured a 54-year-old veteran would just accept his fate and fade quietly into retirement. But they had forgotten one crucial detail. I stood up from the table, my joints creaking slightly, and walked over to the cabinets above the refrigerator. It was the cabinet where no one ever looked, the graveyard where old appliance warranties, manuals for long-discarded electronics, and dried-up pens went to die. I reached into the very back, past a box of light bulbs, and pulled out a thick black 3-ring binder. The plastic cover was warped, and the paper label insert had yellowed to the color of old parchment. In faded ink, it read, "Sinclair Founding Documents." I blew a heavy layer of dust off the top, watching the gray particles dance in the pale morning light. I carried it back to the kitchen table, feeling the weight of the past in my hands. I flipped past the original Articles of Incorporation from 1994, back when our office consisted of 2 folding chairs, a wobbly card table, and a noisy space heater that smelled like burning dust. I bypassed the early team bylaws, the hand-drawn organizational charts, and the original equity split agreements. There, on page 19, I found the hidden clause I needed, Clause 14D. I had written it myself back in 1994, during our first week of operation. My first corporate attorney, a devious and brilliant old soul named Bruce, had insisted on it. At the time, the idea of a $25 million severance payout was an absolute joke. The company did not even have $25,000 in its bank account, and we were surviving on instant noodles and credit card debt. But Bruce, who had seen dozens of promising startups get swallowed by corporate greed, had looked me in the eye and given me some advice I never forgot. He told me that one day the company would get big, rich, and stupid, and when that day came, the new management would try to discard the people who built the foundation. He called Clause 14D my personal kill switch. I had initialed the page in faded blue ink right below the board chairman's spidery signature. The text of the clause was remarkably clear, free of the dense, obfuscated legalese that modern corporate lawyers use to hide their intentions. It stated that any material adverse change to my compensation package, benefits, or overall retirement structure would immediately trigger a severance payout of $25 million, payable in full within 72 business hours of formal notification. The unilateral suspension of my pension benefits by the Human Resources Department was, without a doubt, a material adverse change. The private equity hotshots had wanted to cut costs by freezing my retirement, but they had failed to investigate the connection of the wire they were cutting. They had no idea they had just tripped a high-voltage wire. I closed the binder, the heavy snap of the rings sounding like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. I made myself a second cup of tea, letting the warm steam rise against my face as I gathered my thoughts. I opened my laptop and logged into my corporate email account. My message to the Strata Growth legal department was short, professional, and entirely free of emotional outbursts or threats. I wrote the subject line, Clause 14D activated. In the body of the email, I wrote, "Please be advised that the unilateral suspension of my pension benefits constitutes a material adverse change under my founding agreement. Consequently, I am activating Clause 14D. Please arrange for the wire transfer of $25 million to my account within 72 business hours." I attached a high-resolution scan of page 19 along with the notarized signature page from 2001. I sat back, my finger hovering over the mouse. I felt no anger, no panic. I only felt a deep, cold focus. They had stopped seeing me as a human being and started seeing me as a number. They thought I would go quietly, too tired to fight their teams of lawyers. They were about to learn that legacy does not vanish just because you stop including it in your presentation slides, and that some contracts, especially those signed in sweat and spite, never expire. I clicked send. The transition of Strata Growth from a lean, hungry startup into a multi-million-dollar corporate behemoth had been a slow, agonizing process. In the early days, we knew every client by name, and we measured our success by the quality of the service we provided. But as we grew and eventually went public, the culture began to rot from the top down. 2 years ago, a private equity firm bought a controlling stake, and they brought in a new breed of executives. These were young men and women who had never built anything in their lives, who had never stayed up all night to fix a failing database or spoken face-to-face with an angry customer. They wore tailored suits, spoke exclusively in corporate buzzwords like synergy and paradigm shifts, and viewed the company's history as an obstacle to their short-term financial targets. The leader of this group was our new Chief Financial Officer, Stuart Collins. Stuart was a man who treated employees like errant formulas in a spreadsheet, annoying when they did not align with his goals, and easy to delete. After sending the email, I did not sit around waiting for legal to panic. I knew the corporate machinery would take time to process the threat, and I needed to ensure my own legal representation was ready. I dialed the number of Julian Rayner, my attorney. Julian was a grizzled veteran of contract law who had been on my personal retainer for over 2 decades. He was a man who spoke in a gravelly whisper, a voice shaped by decades of arguing in courtrooms and smoking expensive cigars on golf courses. He was the only person who still remembered the early battles we fought to keep Strata Growth alive. I heard the line click, and Julian's gravelly voice filled the speaker. "Walter," he said, "what is going on? I hope you are calling to tell me you are finally retiring." I smiled, taking a sip of my tea. "Not quite, Julian. I just sent an email to Strata Growth's legal department. I have activated Clause 14D. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint rustle of papers as Julian sat up in his leather chair. "Clause 14D, he asked, his voice dropping an octave. "The founding agreement clause? The one Bruce wrote?" "The very one," I replied. "HR just froze my pension as part of their cost-cutting review. They sent me an automated email this morning." I heard Julian chuckle, a low, dry sound that sounded like sand shifting. "Those absolute fools," he muttered. "They actually did it. They actually touched your compensation. Do they have any idea what they have just signed?" I explained that Stuart Collins and the new legal team likely had no record of the original founding documents in their active folders. They had probably digitized the files 10 years ago and forgotten to import the legacy folders, or they assumed that the subsequent executive compensation restructurings had wiped out the old agreements. "Let me double-check the archive," Julian said, his keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. "If I remember correctly, they tried to get you to sign a new executive compensation package back in 2014 during the major restructuring. Did you ever sign that agreement?" "No," I said, my voice steady. "I remember it vividly. They sent me a thick packet of papers, offering me a higher base salary and a larger stock option pool, but it required me to forfeit my original founder status and rescind the 1994 agreement. I reviewed the terms, realized they were trying to strip away my security, and returned the documents unsigned. I wrote a note on the cover page. Original founder status unchanged. Will retain standing agreement. I sent it back to the head of legal at the time, and they filed it without objection. I still have the email confirmation and the delivery receipt. Julian laughed out loud this time, a full booming sound. Walter, they are completely ruined. The 2014 package was designed to replace all legacy agreements, but since you never executed it, your original founding contract remains the active, governing document. There is no amendment, no rescission notice, and no board resolution that overrides your original terms. The 72-hour clock is running. Do you want me to file a formal notice of default with their external counsel? Not yet, I said, watching the rain beat against my window. Let them have a chance to insult me first. It makes the subsequent legal filings taste much better. Let them believe they can ignore it. Julian agreed, warning me to keep my head down and behave as though nothing had happened. We hung up, and I sat back in my chair. I felt a strange sense of peace. The company had spent years making me feel invisible, treating my 3 decades of experience as a relic of the past. They had forgotten that I was not just an employee. I was woven into the very structure of the business. I had built the walls, and I knew exactly which pillar to pull to bring the entire ceiling down. I opened my daily work planner, wrote down my tasks for the day, and prepared to go to the office. I was going to be the perfect, quiet employee, right up until the moment the bomb exploded. I walked into the office on Tuesday morning, my leather briefcase in hand, wearing my usual gray wool suit. The glass tower of Stratagrowth was humming with its typical frantic energy. Young product managers with expensive haircuts scurried between conference rooms, clutching tablets and debating the merits of their latest agile sprints. I sat at my desk in the compliance department, a quiet corner of the 15th floor, and began my routine work. I approved purchase orders, reviewed vendor contracts, and answered emails, behaving exactly as I did every other day of the year. No one looking at me would have guessed that I had just initiated a $25 million legal countdown. At 10 o'clock, I attended our weekly strategy meeting in the main executive boardroom. The room was dominated by a massive mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city. Stuart Collins sat at the head of the table, clicking his designer pen with a rhythmic, irritating sound. Next to him was Chloe, our brand director, who was presenting a deck on corporate synergy that was clearly copied from a consulting website. Across from her sat Mason, a young project manager who had a habit of using the word disrupt in every sentence. I sat near the back of the room, my notepad open, listening to them talk about optimization and resource allocation. 20 minutes into the meeting, my phone buzzed on the table. I picked it up and saw an email notification from Stuart Collins. I unlocked the screen and read the message. The tone was exactly what I expected, dismissive, arrogant, and condescending. The subject line read, Clause 14D. The body of the email was brief. Walter. Clause 14D is from a legacy document that was superseded during the 2014 compensation restructuring. Our legal team has reviewed the file and confirmed that the clause is no longer active or enforceable. We will not be processing this request. Please focus on your current compliance tasks. Best, Stuart Best. The man had just denied a $25 million contractual obligation and ended the email with the word best. I looked up from my screen and glanced at Stuart, who was nodding along to Chloe's presentation, completely oblivious to the storm he had just invited. I did not reply to the email. I did not look angry. I simply took a sip of my black tea, made a note in my pad, and went back to listening to the presentation. I knew Stuart was a man who treated people like lines in a ledger, assuming that if he wrote them off, they simply ceased to exist. He had no idea that I had a complete, notarized copy of the agreement and that his legal team was about to experience a very rude awakening. That awakening came at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I received a new email notification, a message thread from our internal legal counsel. It was a reply from Melanie Lopez, a junior associate in the legal department who had only been with the company for 6 months. In her haste to update the executive team, she had accidentally copied me on the internal email chain. The email from Melanie read, Stuart, I have located the original hard copy of the founder agreement from the 2001 archive. The The document is fully notarized, and Walter's signature is present on all pages. I have cross-referenced this against the subsequent restructuring agreements from 2014, and we have no signed waiver or rescission form from Walter on file. His original founder status appears to be intact, and there is no record of the clause being superseded. I am continuing to review the enforceability of the 1994 contract, but as of right now, the document is legally active. I stared at the screen, a small smile appearing on my face. Melanie had just confirmed my entire case in writing, and she had sent it directly to me. I took a screenshot of the email, saved the entire thread as a PDF, and moved it into a folder on my personal drive titled Enforce 14D. Inside that folder, I had already organized my original offer letter from July of 1994, the board minutes approving my founder status, and the email chain where I rejected the 2014 package. My paper trail was absolutely airtight. By late afternoon, the atmosphere in the office began to shift. It was a subtle change, the kind of tension you only notice if you have spent 30 years watching corporate behavior. The junior vice presidents were no longer laughing loudly in the hallways. The door to Stewart's office remained firmly shut, and his assistant was turned away from her desk, speaking in hushed whispers on her phone. I noticed that several members of the legal team had requested emergency access to our oldest archive servers, a database that had not been accessed since the dot-com bubble burst. Just before 5 o'clock, I received a voicemail on my personal phone. It was from Marshall, a senior representative from one of our largest logistics vendors. I had known Marshall for 15 years, back when we were still signing contracts on paper and sealing them with handshakes. Walter, Marshall's voice sounded tense, hushed. I am hearing some strange rumors from our compliance contacts. There is talk of a massive internal dispute at Stratagrowth, and some people are worried about contract stability. I am just calling to see if everything is okay on your end. We have a major renewal coming up, and my directors are getting nervous about risk exposure. I did not return the call. I simply saved the voicemail and added it to my folder. The cracks in the glass tower were beginning to show, and the wind was starting to howl through them. The storm broke on Thursday afternoon during what was supposed to be a routine quarterly investor briefing. I joined the conference call on mute, my camera turned off, my name appearing in the participant list as a simple pair of initials. It was a call designed to reassure our institutional shareholders that Stratagrowth was on track for another record-breaking year, despite the recent optimization measures. Stuart Collins was leading the presentation, his voice carrying that familiar, polished confidence that always seemed to mask a lack of actual substance. Toward the end of the call, an analyst from a major institutional pension fund asked a very pointed, aggressive question about potential legal liabilities, unrecorded balance sheet risks, and outstanding contractual disputes. I held my breath in the silence, waiting to see exactly how Stuart would handle it. We have recently identified and resolved a minor contractual inquiry regarding a legacy executive agreement, Stuart said, his tone casual, as if he were talking about a misplaced stapler. It was a routine matter that posed absolutely no material risk to the company's financial standing, and it has already been addressed internally. Our liabilities remain well within our projected limits, and we anticipate zero disruption to our operations. I sat in my office, listening to the recording of the call as it finished, a cold anger settling in my chest. They were lying to their investors, presenting a $25 million default event as a minor inquiry. But the real blow came 12 hours later when Julian Rayner called me on my personal line. His voice, usually so calm and gravelly, was tight with indignation. "Walter, you need to check your personal email immediately," Julian said. An anonymous source within their legal department just sent us a screenshot from their internal server. It was sent through our secure firm portal. I opened the file Julian had sent. It was an email exchange between Stuart Collins and the head of the internal legal team, dated just after my notice had been received. Stuart's words were typed in black and white, a permanent record of his arrogance. Let him push it. He is 54 years old, and too tired to fight this in court. We can easily stall him out in arbitration for years. He will either cave to a smaller settlement or croak before the trial even starts. Either way, we win and save the 25 million. I stared at the screen, my hands resting flat on my desk. For 30 years, I had poured my life into building this company. I had sacrificed my health, my family life, and my peace of mind to ensure that Stratagrowth survived its darkest days. And now, the executives who had inherited my hard work were using my age as a weapon against me, assuming that my 54 years made me weak, slow, and disposable. They thought they could wait for me to die to save a line item on their balance sheet. The anger that washed over me in that moment was not hot, wild, or chaotic. It was ice cold and heavy, the kind of absolute, silent focus that burns through solid stone. I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to the board of directors. I attached the screenshot of Stewart's email, along with the notarized founding documents and the email chain, confirming my rejection of the 2014 restructuring package subject. Formal notice of contractual default and whistleblower evidence. Dear Board of Directors, I wrote. Please find attached direct evidence of internal communications from Chief Financial Officer Stuart Collins, demonstrating not only the company's awareness of the validity of Clause 14D, but a deliberate executive strategy to obstruct and delay payment based on my age. As you are aware, Clause 14D remains active, binding, and fully enforceable. The intentional withholding of these funds, combined with the documented age discrimination and bad faith obstruction, represents a severe breach of fiduciary duty and a violation of the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. I continued, laying out the terms clearly. The 72-hour payment window outlined in Clause 14D will expire on Friday at noon. If the $25 million is not received in my account by that time, we will immediately file for injunctive relief in federal court. We will also submit this evidence of age discrimination to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and notify your major credit providers and underwriting banks of the default. This is your final opportunity to resolve this matter before public litigation begins. Regards, Walter Sinclair, founding partner. I hit send at precisely 9 o'clock on Friday morning. Watching the confirmation icon flash green, I knew the board members would receive it on their devices immediately, and I knew the corporate panic would be instantaneous and severe. Within 30 minutes, I watched Stuart Collins's shared calendar clear completely. Every meeting, every lunch, and every strategy session was canceled, replaced by a single, day-long block titled Internal Review. The legal department went entirely silent, and my routine compliance emails were redirected to an external crisis management law firm based in New York. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. The drizzle had stopped, but the clouds remained low and heavy. I felt no doubt, no fear. They had believed my age was a vulnerability, a weakness they could exploit to protect their margins. They were about to discover that 3 decades of survival in the corporate trenches had not made me weak. It had made me dangerous. Friday noon came and went without the arrival of the wire. I sat at my desk, watching the digital clock on my monitor tick from 11:59 to 12 o'clock. The payment window had officially closed. They had allowed their pride and arrogance to override their legal obligations, and by doing so, they had triggered the automatic escalation terms of the founding agreement. Within minutes of the deadline passing, Julian Rayner filed our application for injunctive relief in federal court. Along with the motion, we submitted the whistleblower email containing Stewart's ageist remarks. The legal machinery I had spent decades studying began to grind them down with mechanical indifference. The court acted with surprising speed, issuing a subpoena for the company's internal server logs, specifically targeting all communications regarding the pension freeze, retirement strategies, and my name. At the same time, the automatic default notices were delivered to Stratagrowth's primary banking partners and underwriters. The impact was immediate and devastating. In the corporate world, a default on a $25 million founder agreement is not a private matter. It is a financial red flag that triggers automatic safeguards in every commercial lending contract. By Monday morning, Stratagrowth's primary credit line, an $80 million facility that they used to fund daily operations and vendor payments, was frozen by their lead bank pending a full risk assessment. The office was in complete chaos. I watched from my desk as employees hurried from room to room, their faces pale and anxious. The internal chat channels, usually filled with jokes and casual planning, went completely silent. Rumors of a massive cash flow crisis began to spread like a gas leak. On Tuesday morning, the pressure became too great for the board to ignore. Stuart Collins resigned from his position as Chief Financial Officer, effective immediately. The official internal announcement claimed he was leaving for personal reasons and thanked him for his legacy of innovation. But everyone in the building knew the truth. He had been thrown overboard to appease the nervous investors. That afternoon, I ran into Harold Stinson, one of our largest legacy shareholders, in the elevator. Harold was a man of old wealth with white hair and a handshake like concrete. He looked at me for a long moment as the elevator descended, his expression a mix of respect and fear. "Is it true, Walter?" Harold asked, his voice low. "Did Stuart really try to stall you because of your age?" I did not blink. I simply looked at him and gave a slight, polite nod. "I have always respected the contracts we signed, Harold. I expect the company to do the same." Harold sighed, looking down at his shoes. "It is a disaster," he muttered as the doors opened. "The stock is down 18%, and we are scrambling to rebuild our credit lines. It never should have come to this." He was right. It never should have. But when you treat people like numbers, you forget that some numbers have the power to multiply. By Wednesday, the default penalties were fully active, adding a compound interest charge of 3.2% per business day to the $25 million balance. The New York crisis firm tried to file a motion to stay the enforcement, claiming they were acting in good faith to resolve the dispute. The federal judge denied the motion within the hour, stating that the terms of the 1994 agreement were clear, unambiguous, and fully binding. On Thursday, the collateral damage of Stewart's blunder became public. Strata Growth announced a restructuring plan that included the immediate layoff of 57 employees. It was a bitter pill to swallow. These were good people, compliance analysts, developers, and administrative assistants who had done nothing wrong, yet they were paying the price for the greed of their executives. But the board had no choice. They had to free up liquidity to cover the mounting default costs. Finally, on Monday morning, the battle ended. I logged into my bank app and saw a single beautiful line item: incoming wire transfer of $25 million plus interest and legal fees. The funds had cleared. A few minutes later, I received an email from Jeremy Hartman, the newly appointed acting chief financial officer. The message was polite, apologetic, and filled with deep regret for the circumstances that had led to the dispute. I did not reply. The check had cleared, the contract was satisfied, and my work here was finished. I packed my few personal belongings into a cardboard box, my notebook, my favorite ceramic mug, and a few reference manuals. I walked out of the Strata Growth building for the last time, feeling the cool autumn breeze on my face. I drove 6 hours north to a small, isolated cabin I owned on the shores of a quiet lake, far away from cellular towers and internet connections. I sat on the wooden deck that evening, watching the sun set over the water, casting long shadows across the pine trees. In my hands, I held my leather-bound notebook, filled with 3 decades of observations, strategies, and lessons about corporate power. On the final page, I wrote, "They built the company on my back. I left with what I was owed." I closed the book, took a sip of my warm tea, and smiled. The walls had collapsed, not because I had screamed or fought, but because I had simply held them to the agreement they had signed. I was free, and they would never forget my name.